Slavery, like patriarchy or like hierarchy, is actually a very recent phenomenon. Slavery, patriarchy, other forms of hierarchical domination in society are not that old. The first forms of human slavery go back to ancient Sumer, toward the very beginnings of civilization. Now, when I say civilization, I mean something very specific. I mean agricultural society, which began 10,000 years ago. And for millions of years before that period, all of our history as humans and all of our human ancestors lived in small hunting-gathering bands. But one of the most radical changes to ever happen in human history happened just 10,000 years ago when we began to settle in one location and began to farm and to domesticate the wild plants and animals. 10,000 years ago, that's all. Before then, no patriarchy. Before then, no hierarchical domination. Before then, equality within society, basic harmony with nature. So, actually, the first form of slavery was the enslavement of animals. That began with agricultural society. Because again, agricultural society means the domestication of the wild, the domestication of plants. We cultivate plants. The domestication of animals. We start to breed animals. We start to keep animals and to exploit them for our use. It's the beginning of a process that culminates today with genetic engineering, whereby we take the wild and we colonize it and we change it technologically and exploit it for our purposes. So, for instance, we began to use animals for food, for transportation, and for labor. We brought them into our societies. They no longer ran free or wild. We confined them. We branded them. We castrated them. We controlled these animals and exploited them in any number of ways. And now this is a very important point that very few people understand. Racism, sexism, ableism, and many forms of human hierarchy have their origins in speciesism. And of course, by speciesism, I mean the philosophy that we are radically unique from all other animals, that in fact we are not even an animal, we are superior to them, and they exist for our purposes, and we can do what we wish with them. When you ask the question, who is the human being? Who is Homo sapiens? What's the answer? Rational man. Rational man. In other words, we deny rationality to animals, we deny our own animality, and we establish ourselves as a pure rational essence, a mind without a body almost, as Descartes later said. Now, that means that if the human is the rational, any form of human, any type of human group, women, people of color, islanders, the disabled, etc., if they are thought to be less than rational, they are said to be less than human. They are closer to animals than to humans. So we call them subhumans. And every time we go to war with another nation, we always reduce people to animals. They are rats, they are dogs, they are monkeys, they are vermin. Always they have to be dehumanized, and then they are easy to kill. Because we already have speciesism as the foundation of our conceptual thought thinking and of our society, of our civilization. So we've created this box, animals, no reason, no moral status, and we can take any people, drag them into that box by saying they have no rationality, therefore they have no rights. So I'm saying that if you believe in human rights, you better believe in animal rights, because you will never get human rights without animal rights, and vice versa. If you want to abolish sexism, if you want to abolish racism, you must understand these philosophies came from speciesism. So when civilization came about and we domesticated animals and we defined ourselves in sharp opposition to them as rational beings, we treated women like animals. We treated slaves who were captured from warfare like animals. They were not full members of society. We bred them like animals. They were considered to be resources for breeding, for exploitation, just like animals. Now, all the technologies that were used to enslave human beings in the modern international slave trade, chains, whips, cages, auctions, branding, all of these things were first done to animals. And the first philosopher of slavery was Aristotle. Aristotle created a hierarchy of value in the universe. It was a scale of perfection, and the more rationality a being had, the more perfect that being was. So God was at the top of the hierarchy, humans were not far below, and women and slaves were toward the bottom, and animals were at the very bottom. And to quote Aristotle, just as plants exist for animals, so animals exist for humans. So lower forms of life serve the purpose for higher forms of life. Slavery was a natural and just fact of the universe. There was nothing wrong about it. It was natural. And thus you have the beginnings of Western thought. Western thought is grounded not 2,500 years ago, but in the beginnings of agricultural society, and that's rooted in speciesism and the domestication of animals. So now, jump ahead to the 15th century when the international slave trade begins with Henry the Navigator in the early 15th century taking slaves from Africa to Portugal, and then of course Columbus, 1492, taking slaves from Africa and various islands to Spain and other European nations. In the United States, slavery had reached its height. Millions of slaves taken from Africa across the dreaded Middle Passage, and they went to the absolute worst country you could go to be a slave. And just like we did with animals, we shipped them, we chained them, we beat them, we auctioned them, we branded them, we broke up families, and we sent them off for slave labor for their owners. Now, actually, what I'm saying so far is very controversial. And what I want to do is define what a slave is and respond to two objections to using the word slavery to apply to animals. So I'm saying animals are slaves, they can be slaves, they are the oldest, it is the oldest form of slavery, and it is the most prevalent, dominant, bloodiest, barbaric form of slavery ever invented, and it continues and it is escalating. So what, you have to have two legs to be a slave? No. A slave is any being, any sentient being who knows the difference between pleasure and pain and between freedom and domination. A slave is any being held captive against its will. A slave is forced to labor for another. This slave is the property of this other, and this other is the owner of the slave. The owner has legal rights, including the right of life and death over the slave. So a slave is any sentient being, human or non-being, with its will denied, its freedom denied, its basic instinct to be free denied to it. Its natural life instincts are thwarted, controlled, and blocked. It is a subject, the subject of a life, reduced to an object, to a mere resource, thing, and commodity. And it is violated and perverted in every facet of its life. Now let me give you some examples of how animals are slaves, and I think you'll start to get a clear idea of what I mean by animal slavery. Consider a few different cases. 1, circuses, zoos, rodeos, and aquariums. In every case, they're held captive against their will. They're taken from the wild. They're taken from their families. They are forced to labor, which we call performance. In a zoo, your performance is just to be there, but you're performing for an audience. For instance, in an aquarium, why do you think orca whales kill their trainers? They're confined in a small artificial tank. They are compelled to perform labor up to 6 or 8 shows a day before a bunch of screaming idiots. Thank you. Thank you. Let's hear it. Thank you. I appreciate it. Molto grazie. Consider another case. Oxes, horses, and mules, or horse carriages, an issue here recently in Italy. They're held captive, they're owned, they're forced to do labor. They're enslaved in every sense of the word. 2 more examples, slightly more subtle or complex. Farmed animals. Think of a chicken in a cage, in a battery cage. Think of a dairy cow tied to a machine, a milk machine. They're held captive, they're owned, their property. What is their labor? They're forced to produce what? Forced to produce eggs. Forced to produce milk. Eggs, will they do forced molting to make them produce more eggs than naturally they will? Cows are pumped full of genetically modified growth steroid hormones to produce far more milk than they normally would. That is their labor. Okay? They are slaves. One more example. Think of laboratory animals, rats, mice, rabbits, etc. Cats, dogs. You would think, what do they perform to do? They don't make entertainment. They don't do shows. They don't make products. What is their labor? What is their labor? Their bodies are violated to produce data. The data is used to produce drugs that kill humans. I hope I've made a case that it makes sense to use the term animal slavery. The animals are slaves in a very literal sense. Now, there are 2 controversial responses to this. Especially in the United States, this is a very sensitive issue. You might know the PETA campaign, where they say that animals are slaves, and they juxtapose a picture of animals in cages with chains, say an elephant, with African Americans in chains. They did not score any points with that campaign. The African Americans, almost without exception, denounced that campaign as racist. And do you know what the problem with that campaign was? Do you know why they objected to it? They have been likened to animals their entire history. Now, of course, they are animals, we are animals, and there should be no objection to that, but given the context of slavery, one can understand this is a natural reaction. And one should be very sensitive about such analogies and comparisons. And so one has to wonder, if there was speciesism, could there have been racism? If we never had speciesism, could we have had racism? But despite the just objections to the PETA campaign, I have to insist that animals are slaves just like humans are slaves. And in fact, that African Americans could not have been enslaved without the conceptual paradigms and the technologies already used on animals. And I don't want to get into this, but there are similar problems with the analogy of Holocaust. I say this word all the time. I can't say it in Germany. They don't like that. The animal Holocaust. Jewish people object to that because they feel it detracts from their unique historical experience. But if you read Charles Patterson's book, The Eternal Treblinka, you can see the Jewish community is divided over this. Some people say it is only by being a victim of the Nazi Holocaust I can understand the animal Holocaust and condemn this. I have experienced what it's like to be treated that way. Okay, now the second objection, and then we go into abolitionism. The second objection comes not from African Americans, particularly the United States, but from Marxists, from the leftist community. Being a Marxist, being a leftist, being an anarchist almost my entire life, I feel safe in saying that Marxists, anarchists, and leftists are idiots. In the 19th century, they could believably, thank you. In the I am not a conservative. You got that point, huh? In the 19th century, the Marxists could say, we hold the mantle of progress. We champion the most advanced moral values and scientific values. And the left in general was indeed on the progressive cutting edge of change in society. What happened to send them back to the Paleolithic era when it comes to understanding animal rights? They make the weakest objections to animal rights. They are the most difficult speciesists to have a rational conversation with. They believe they, of course, are all carnivores, and they have internalized the worst aspects of Western culture in terms of anthropocentrism and speciesism. They've internalized it more than anyone. Now the left says this. The left says that it's the Cartesian worldview. Animals are machines. They are governed by instincts. They have no complex subjectivity. They don't have free will. So how can you be a slave if you don't have free will? The anarchist, Mikhail Kropotkin, said, define humans as the animal that rebels. The only animal that rebels. That was his definition of the human. Are you kidding me? How many thousands of examples could I give to you about animal rebellion, animal revolt, animal revenge? How many circus tigers wait for that right moment to rip apart their trainer? How many orca whales just one day lose it and drown their trainer, kill their trainer intentionally without mercy? There are so many examples. I refer you to a book you must read. It's in English, I'm sorry. It's by an author named Jason Ribal, R-H-I-B-A-L, Jason Ribal. And it's called I'm forgetting the title, but something like the Revenge of the Animals, Fear of an Animal Planet, the Fear of an Animal Planet. And as you have all read, you've seen one time or another, there are thousands of examples of animals resisting. Why? Because they want freedom. They refuse to be slaves, and they will wait for the right moment to rebel. They will patiently wait, and they know they might receive punishment, but they will rebel. Now, let me talk about the abolitionist movement against human slavery in the United States. This movement began in 1832 and ended in 1865 with the formal end of slavery. Of course, there are all kinds of positions about slavery in the United States. Some people said that blacks should stay slaves. That was the position of the slave owners. And indeed, the U.S. political elite and the U.S. Constitution said that blacks are property who should be slaves. There were people who said, just get rid of this problem, repatriate African Americans back to Africa. Just get rid of them. There were people who said, this is an awful system, we must reform it. We must treat the slaves more kindly. And then there were the abolitionists. And the abolitionist position was, you do not regulate slavery, you can only abolish it, and abolish it immediately, totally, completely, no compromise, right now. The only humane way to treat a slave is to free it. Now, I want to emphasize just a few things about this movement because it's important for the so-called new abolitionist movement today. Namely this movement was very diverse and plural in its composition and in its tactics. This movement included men and women. Feminists in the United States, the suffragettes, started off their political careers in the abolitionist movement. This movement included rich people and poor people. It cut across class lines. It had sympathizers far and wide. This movement included whites and blacks. And amongst the blacks, it included free blacks and blacks who were still enslaved. Lots of different people claimed affiliation to and supported the abolitionist movement in the United States. Now, their tactics were also very diverse, and this is important. They struggled through legal means. They tried to educate the masses. The abolitionists were agitators. A lot of them were white agitators like William Lloyd Garrison. They ran newspapers. They tried to educate people to realizing that blacks and whites were equal, that this was against the Bible, it was against the Constitution. And then there was the violent edge, okay? There was John Brown. John Brown was a tall man who looked like God with a white beard. He was a fervent Christian. And he led a small band of men, including his own sons, in an armed uprising against the army. They were captured, they were killed, John Brown was hung, and forever today he remains a hero and an inspiration to all liberators. Nat Turner was a black slave. One night he gathered together a group of men with guns and swords, and he killed 55 white slave owners in one night. Needless to say, he was executed, but his act of defiance inspired more defiance everywhere. And then there was an amazing woman, a short, black, older woman named Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was the engineer of the Underground Railroad. Now, I don't mean that literally. There wasn't a railroad where slaves, were shipped all the way to Canada and to the free North. But it was a series of homes and safe stations, all one after the other, people who would take in slaves, feed them, care for them, get them to the next place, all the way to the free North or all the way to Canada. Appreciate what this woman did. She freed herself as a slave. She came back and freed her family. She came back and freed friends and anyone who had the courage to come with her. The miles were uncountable. The weather could have been brutal. The conditions were dangerous. She did this at least a dozen times, always successfully, and in fact, toward the end of the Civil War, she knew the territory so well that the North hired her as a scout into the South to fight the Southern Confederate Army. Obviously, she broke the law. She didn't give a damn about the law. As I say, when the law is wrong, the right thing to do is break it. She broke it every chance she could. Now, does the Harriet Tubman or the Underground Railroad remind you of anything happening in the contemporary animal liberation movement? Oh, say something that emerged in England in the 1970s, the mid-1970s? Does it remind you of the Animal Liberation Front? They, too, had a series of veterinarians who would help, people who would rehome cats and dogs with tattoos on their ears. They had a series of places to take animals to freedom when they took them out of laboratories. And they called that the Underground Railroad. This movement, again, was highly diverse. It had some extremely radical tactics. It used anything and everything that worked, and it continues today to inspire the animal liberation movement.